The thunder of artillery echoed across the ruined fields of France in the late months of 1944. The war that once seemed like a guaranteed German victory had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Exhausted, half-starved soldiers of the Wehrmacht dug into muddy trenches, trying to hold back the relentless advance of the Allied forces. The skies above belonged to American bombers, and the roads trembled under the weight of Allied tanks. For many German soldiers, surrender had become the only path left. But even in surrender, they expected fear, humiliation, and pain. They had been told that the Americans were brutal, that capture meant suffering or execution. But what awaited them was something they could never have imagined. When German soldiers were captured, they were stunned to learn their destination. Instead of being held in France or Britain, many were told they would be transported across the Atlantic, to the United States itself. The news sounded impossible. How could anyone ship thousands of prisoners across a vast ocean still filled with U-boats in danger? Yet for the Americans, it was completely doable. Their industrial might was so immense that they could build ships faster than the Germans could sink them. And so, for the captured men of the Wehrmacht, began a journey into the heart of their enemy's homeland, a journey that would shatter everything they thought they knew. The transport ships were cold and crowded. German POWs, stripped of their weapons and rank, were placed under guard by young American soldiers, many of whom were barely older than they were. Some prisoners expected cruelty, but what they found instead was a strange sort of order and discipline. The Americans followed rules. They gave food, medical care, and blankets. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival. And after months of retreat and chaos, even that felt unusual. The trip across the Atlantic took weeks. And in those long days, many of the Germans began to talk quietly among themselves. What kind of country was America, really? They had heard stories of case, crime, and greed, but the fact that their captors could transport them thousands of miles across the ocean in safety, while feeding them, hinted at something far different. As the ships neared the American coastline, the tension grew. Some prisoners stood silently at the railings, trying to imagine what they would see. In their minds, the United States was a place of propaganda. Decadent cities filled with jazz, corruption, and mechanical monsters. Nazi media had painted it as a morally bankrupt nation, full of lazy workers and weak soldiers. But when the coastline finally appeared through the mist, they saw something they couldn't comprehend. Towering cranes moved in perfect rhythm at the docks, loading and unloading ships by the dozens. Factories lined the shores, their chimneys releasing thick white smoke. Endless rows of trucks, cars, and trains moved along the horizon. Even from afar, the scale of it all was overwhelming. America wasn't just surviving the war, it was thriving in it. The German POWs were marched off the ships, guarded but unharmed. The docks were alive with activity, workers moving crates, soldiers shouting orders, women operating forklifts, and trains whistling in the distance. Everything seemed to move with purpose and speed. One prisoner, decades later, recalled thinking, "This is what power looks like." Germany never had this. The smell of fuel, steel, and freshly baked bread filled the air. Even in wartime, there was abundance, something unimaginable back home, where cities like Hamburg and Dresden lay in ruins and food was rationed to crumbs. The Americans didn't treat the new arrivals like slaves or enemies to be beaten. They were processed, registered, and put on trains that would take them to camps scattered across the United States, from Texas to Iowa, from Georgia to Wisconsin. As they traveled deeper inland, the prisoners looked out of the train windows in stunned silence. The countryside wasn't destroyed. Towns were full of life. Children played in the streets. Farms stretched endlessly, with fields of wheat and corn so vast they disappeared into the horizon. They passed by factories, enormous buildings filled with machines, smoke, and workers. Every town seemed to have a train station, a power line, and trucks rolling down the roads. For soldiers who came from a Europe in ruins, it was like stepping onto another planet. Some whispered among themselves, "Are we seeing the real America, or is this a show for us?" The idea that any country could look like this after years of war seemed impossible. Germany's cities were piles of rubble. Even in rural areas, the war had drained the land of men and resources. Yet here was a nation that seemed untouched, a place where production hadn't slowed, where everyone still had food, clothes, and even smiles. The shock among the POWs was not just from fear or curiosity. It was from a deep, unsettling realization that maybe they had been lied to all along. For many, this was their first contact with ordinary Americans. The guards on the trains were often relaxed, joking, and sometimes even friendly. They weren't cruel or hateful, just firm. When they offered cigarettes or rations to the prisoners, some Germans refused at first, thinking it was a trick. But it wasn't. The Americans had so much that they could afford to share, even with enemies. It was a level of confidence that came from true abundance, from an industrial system so vast that even the act of generosity didn't cost them anything. As the trains rolled across the American landscape, the prisoners began to understand what had powered the Allied war machine. It wasn't just soldiers and generals. It was the factories, the trains, the farms, and the millions of ordinary men and women who worked behind the scenes. America was fighting with machines and resources on a scale the Germans had never imagined possible. The prisoners couldn't help but compare this to the conditions back home, where shortages, bombings, and exhaustion had crippled their war effort. They realized that this, more than anything, explained why they were now the ones in chains. When the trains finally stopped and the prisoners were led to their camps, they were still silent. Not out of fear, but from awe. Some of them had seen the might of American bombers overhead. Now they had seen the industrial heart that built them. They didn't know it yet, but their time in America would continue to challenge everything they thought they knew about war, about power, and about the people they had been taught to hate. The first leg of their journey had ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. Inside those barbed wire fences scattered across America, thousands of German soldiers would come face to face with a world that operated not through terror or propaganda, but through production, innovation, and freedom. And it was in those moments, far from home, surrounded by the hum of American industry, that many German POWs began to realize the true meaning of power. The rumble of the train wheels slowly faded as the German POWs were escorted into their new camps scattered across the United States. Most had spent the entire journey glued to the windows, unable to believe what they were seeing. The farther they went from the coasts, the more amazed they became. America, unlike Europe, wasn't covered in bomb craters or shattered cities. There were no burned-out factories or broken bridges. Instead, they saw shiny locomotives, endless farms, and small towns that looked like something out of a dream. Grocery stores filled with goods, clean streets, and homes with lights glowing in every window. For men who came from the ruins of Hamburg, Cologne, or Berlin, it was like stepping into another world. When they finally arrived at the dams, the first thing that hit them was how well organized everything was. Fences, guard towers, barracks, all arranged with perfect order. The Americans ran the camps with the same efficiency they ran their factories. Every prisoner was registered, assigned a number, checked by a medic, and given clean clothes. There were rules, of course, but they were clear and consistent. For many Germans who had experienced the chaos and desperation of the collapsing Reich, this strange sense of order was almost comforting. Then came the real shock. The food. POWs expected to be starved, maybe fed scraps or leftovers. Instead, they were handed trays filled with meat, bread, potatoes, and even dessert. Some prisoners refused to eat at first, thinking it must be a trick. But it wasn't. Day after day, the food kept coming, fresh, filling, and far better than what most German soldiers had eaten in months. One captured sergeant later wrote in his diary, "In Germany, my family stood in bread lines. Here, our enemies feed us like guests." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What truly astonished them was that this wasn't special treatment. The Americans fed their prisoners well simply because they could. The U.S. agricultural machine was unstoppable. Farms stretched endlessly across the Midwest, producing so much grain, corn, and meat that the country could feed its own population, its armies overseas, and millions of prisoners, all at once. The POWs realized that behind every American soldier was an entire nation working efficiently and fearlessly. As they settled into camp life, the prisoners began to see more signs of America's abundance. The camps themselves were built from prefabricated materials, delivered in massive quantities by trucks and trains. Electricity ran through every barrack. Water was clean, and medical treatment was immediate. Many POWs compared it to German military hospitals and found that, surprisingly, American camp clinics were better supplied. Even the guards wore uniforms made from quality fabric and boots that seemed brand new. It was as if the United States had a limitless supply of everything, and in truth, it nearly did. Occasionally, work details took groups of prisoners outside the camps, to farms, sawmills, or factories. That was when their sense of disbelief deepened. They expected ruined cities, rationing, or at least signs of hardship. Instead, they saw store windows filled with products, gas stations operating freely, and people living normal lives. Housewives driving cars, teenagers drinking Coca-Cola, trucks carrying fresh produce, lumber, and machinery along highways that seemed to stretch forever. There were no shortages, no panic, just confidence. In Europe, the Germans had been told that Allied citizens were starving and struggling, that America was weak and divided. But standing in the middle of a bustling town square in Iowa or Texas, surrounded by noise, color, and energy, the prisoners realized how false those claims had been. This country wasn't weak. It was unstoppable. One prisoner of war recalled his amazement when he was assigned to work on a farm. The farmer, a middle-aged man with a friendly smile, drove him to the fields in a huge truck. Back home, the prisoner said, we had maybe one tractor in the entire village. Here, every farm had three. The farmer's wife brought sandwiches, milk, and fruit for lunch, things that had become luxuries in Germany. When the prisoner hesitated to eat, the farmer laughed and said, there's plenty more where that came from. It was a simple sentence, but for that German soldier, it was unforgettable. The German prisoners couldn't comprehend how this was possible. The war had been raging for years. How could America still be so full of life and energy? The answer was industry. An industry that ran 24 hours a day, powered by millions of workers, men and women alike. The Germans had underestimated it completely. They had believed that America was soft, distracted, incapable of sustaining a long war. What they saw with their own eyes shattered that illusion forever. The POWs began to notice another thing: the attitude of ordinary Americans. Despite the hatred that the war had created, most civilians didn't show personal anger toward the prisoners. Farmers who supervised them in the fields treated them fairly. Factory managers offered water and breaks. Even children were curious rather than cruel. The Germans couldn't understand it. They had been taught that enemies were monsters, that hatred was natural. Yet here they were in the land of their enemy, being treated with a kind of decency they hadn't expected even from their own officers. Some American guards even joked with the prisoners, teaching them English words or sharing cigarettes. It was in these small, quiet moments that many Germans started to question everything they had been told back home. If these people, their supposed enemies, could live like this, then what else had their leaders lied about? As weeks turned into months, rumors began to spread inside the camps. Some prisoners said that the Americans had built entire cities just to impress them, that this abundance couldn't be real. Others argued that it was genuine, that this was what a truly industrialized and organized nation looked like. When they learned that every single item, from their uniforms to their food trays, had been mass-produced somewhere in the U.S., many felt a deep, sinking feeling in their stomachs. They realized that Germany, for all its engineering genius, simply couldn't compete with this scale. The contrast between home and America haunted them. In Germany, air raid sirens wailed daily. Cities were flattened, families scavenged for food. The Reich promised victory, but delivered only rubble. Here, in America, life went on as if the war was happening in another world. The POWs watched the trains pass by carrying tanks, airplanes, and trucks, not to rebuild destroyed cities, but to send even more supplies overseas. It was clear that for the United States, war production wasn't a struggle, it was a routine. Some prisoners of war began writing letters home, careful to avoid censorship, but trying to describe what they had seen. They wrote of clean towns, smiling people, and overflowing stores. One wrote, "If you could see this place, you would not believe it." The Americans live as if the war doesn't exist. They have everything. For many families in Germany, those letters were the first hint the Nazi vision of America had been a lie. By the end of 1944, word had spread among the German prisoners. America wasn't just winning the war with weapons. It was winning it with production. Every truck, every plane, every rifle was a product of this vast machine. The POWs had come expecting to see a struggling, divided land. Instead, they found a confident, powerful nation that could fight across oceans and still keep its citizens fed, clothed, and happy. As winter approached, many of them began to realize that they were witnessing something historic. The full power of American industry at its peak. They didn't know it yet, but their time here would forever change how they saw the world. The war had taught them fear, but America was teaching them something else. That strength could come not from terror or ideology, but from unity, innovation, and hard work. The German POWs had entered the United States as enemies, but as they looked around at this land of abundance, they couldn't help but wonder, had they been fighting the wrong kind of power all along? Life inside the American POW camps began with disbelief. For the German soldiers who had fought in the mud and blood of Europe, captivity had always been described as a living nightmare, a place of starvation, humiliation, and endless labor. But as the days passed behind American fences, that image began to crumble. What they found was something far different, a system that ran on discipline, but also on a strange sense of fairness. Each camp had its own rhythm. The morning whistle would blow, and rows of prisoners would step out for roll call, standing under the open sky of Texas, Georgia, or Minnesota. The guards kept watch, rifles slung over their shoulders, but there was no screaming or brutality. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention strictly, something that shocked many prisoners who had never believed their enemy capable of such restraint. Breakfast was served, real meals, not scraps, eggs, bread, potatoes, and sometimes even fruit or coffee. The first few weeks were filled with suspicion. The Germans whispered among themselves, wondering if the Americans were trying to soften them for interrogation. But that never came. No one was tortured. No one was starved. They were simply fed, clothed, and assigned work. Soon routine took over. The POWs realized that the Americans had no interest in revenge. The guards didn't beat them. They didn't mock them. In fact, many guards were young men who treated their prisoners like fellow soldiers rather than monsters. Some even respected them, the same way soldiers on opposite sides can recognize each other's courage. Many camps were built in the heartland, far from major cities. They were surrounded by fields and forests where the air smelled of pine and fresh soil. Barbed wire fences marked the perimeter, but the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. There were barracks with bunks, canteens, and recreation areas. The prisoners could play soccer, write letters, or read books from the camp library. For the first time in years, many of them slept without the sound of bombs overhead. But the real surprise came when the Americans began allowing POWs to work, voluntarily. The U.S. faced a severe labor shortage during the war, as millions of American men were overseas. So the War Department permitted prisoners to work on farms, in sawmills, and even in small factories, all under supervision. For their labor, they were paid in scrip, a kind of camp currency that they could use to buy cigarettes, snacks, or stationery. The Germans were astonished. Their enemy was paying them to work and allowing them a small taste of freedom. Working outside the camps exposed the Germans to ordinary American life in ways they had never expected. They saw the kindness of farmers' families who brought them lunch in the fields. They saw women driving tractors, managing stores, and running entire farms on their own while their husbands fought overseas. They saw American workers smiling, joking, and living without fear of air raids or food shortages. It was a completely different world, one that slowly began to change how many POWs saw the United States. At first, they were cautious. Some refused to believe what they were seeing. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a chaotic, degenerate land ruled by greed. But these everyday scenes, children going to school, farmers working together, communities thriving, didn't match the image they had been taught. As one German lieutenant later wrote, "We were taught that Americans were weak. What we saw were people who worked harder than anyone we knew. Inside the camps, education programs were introduced. The American government, working through organizations like the YMCA, provided books, newspapers, and even classes. Some prisoners of war learned English. Others studied mathematics, mechanics, or history. Many took advantage of these opportunities, not because they were forced to, but because it gave them a sense of purpose. Some camps even organized orchestras and theater performances. Music filled the evenings as prisoners played violins and harmonicas, trying to bring a bit of humanity back into their lives. One of the most surprising aspects was how much respect existed between guards and prisoners. Over time, trust grew. In some camps, the guards even allowed the Germans to run much of their daily routine themselves. They elected camp leaders, organized work details, and managed internal discipline. It wasn't freedom, but it was dignity. There were, of course, moments of tension. Some hardline Nazis within the camps tried to maintain control, spreading fear among those who showed respect toward the Americans. They called them traitors or soft Germans. In some cases, secret Nazi groups tried to enforce loyalty through intimidation. But gradually, as the war turned decisively against Germany, that influence faded. More and more POWs began to accept that the world they had fought for, the one promised by Hitler, was collapsing. They began to talk more openly with the Americans. Some shared stories about their families, their fears, and the hardships they had faced on the Eastern Front or in bombed-out German cities. For many, these conversations were the first real human connection they had had since the war began, and it made them see their captors differently, not as monsters, but as men who lived with hope and compassion even in wartime. Letters home were carefully censored, but the POWs found ways to describe what they saw. Many wrote about how they were treated, how well fed they were, and how peaceful life in America seemed. These letters, when they reached Germany, quietly spread a message that contradicted everything the Nazi government had claimed. Families began to realize that the brutal enemy might not be so brutal after all. For some prisoners, their time in America became a turning point. They began to reflect on what their country had done, the lies they had believed, the blind obedience they had followed. The contrast was too strong to ignore. In Germany, fear ruled. In America, freedom seemed to flow even within the walls of captivity. Even the simple act of seeing American newspapers, which openly criticized their own government, shocked the Germans. In their homeland, questioning the Führer could mean death. Here, people argued about politics, disagreed publicly, and still worked together as a nation. It was confusing, but also enlightening. As months turned into years, the camps became their own small worlds. Some prisoners of war grew gardens, others built furniture, and a few even painted murals on the walls of their barracks. They found small ways to feel human again. They knew they were prisoners, but they also knew they were safe, and that realization alone was powerful. One POW later recalled, "I began to see that freedom is not only a word, it is a way of living." Even the guards had it in their eyes. For men who had spent their lives under a regime of control, this was a revelation. By 1945, as the war neared its end, the camps were filled with reflection and quiet conversations about the future. What would happen when they returned home? What kind of Germany would they find? Many had made up their minds that they would never forget what they saw in America, a nation that could be both strong and humane, powerful yet compassionate. They came as enemies, but they were learning, slowly and unexpectedly, from their captors. And in that learning, the seeds of a new understanding were taking root. For those German POWs, life behind American fences was not just imprisonment. It was a mirror, showing them what true power looked like and how completely they had misunderstood it. The end of the war came quietly for most German POWs in the United States. There were no gunshots, no grand speeches, just whispers spreading through the camps that Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. For a moment, there was silence, followed by disbelief. Many prisoners stood frozen, staring at the ground, unable to process it. The Reich that had promised them glory and victory was gone, replaced by rubble and occupation. They had left as soldiers of a powerful nation. Now they were men without a country, held in the land of their former enemy. But as the shock faded, Something else began to take its place. Reflection. The war was over, and so was the ideology that had shaped their lives. Inside the camps, a strange calm settled in. Guards and prisoners alike seemed to understand that the hatred between them had lost its meaning. For the Germans, the weeks after surrender were filled with questions. What had all the fighting been for? How could a nation as advanced as Germany have been defeated so completely? The answer, they realized, had been around them all along. In the trains, the factories, the food, and the freedom they had witnessed during their captivity. Many prisoners of war began writing in journals, trying to capture what they had learned. Some wrote about the scale of American production, the factories that never stopped, the endless trains carrying supplies, the energy of workers who never complained. They remembered seeing young women working in assembly lines, farmers driving tractors, and mechanics repairing machines faster than they could break. America had fought a war of machines, not desperation. It had won not by fear, but by organization and spirit. When the American officials began repatriating the prisoners, the process was methodical. The camps were closed one by one. The Germans were given new clothes, medical checks, and even farewell meals. Many of them shook hands with their guards before leaving, an act that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The journey back across the Atlantic felt surreal. The same ocean that had carried them as captives now carried them home as survivors and witnesses. When their ships reached the shattered ports of Europe, the contrast hit them like a blow. Cities were nothing but ruins. Railways lay twisted. Bridges were broken. Children wandered through rubble searching for food. The air smelled of ash and dust. It was as if they had stepped from one world into another, from abundance into despair. For many, the shock was overwhelming. They had seen America's power firsthand, and now they saw the full measure of Germany's defeat. Some couldn't hold back their tears. Others walked through the ruins silently, thinking of the farms, the clean streets, and the laughter they had seen in America. It was then that the realization truly sank in. Germany had lost long before its armies surrendered. It had lost when it tried to fight a war against a nation that could build faster, produce more, and feed its people even in wartime. But the lesson wasn't just about machines or factories. It was about people, about how Americans lived, worked, and treated even their enemies. Many prisoners of war had experienced a kind of humanity in those camps that they hadn't expected. They had seen fairness, discipline, and freedom coexisting, something completely opposite to what they had known under Nazi rule. That memory stayed with them. In the months that followed, these former prisoners became silent teachers in the ruins of Germany. They told their families and neighbors about what they had seen, about the clean towns, the overflowing shops, the well-fed workers. They described the guards who treated them with respect and the farmers who shared food without fear. Some Germans didn't believe them at first. "You're exaggerating," they said. "No country could live like that in wartime." But the POWs insisted it was real. Slowly, their stories began to spread. Through conversations, letters, and whispers, they became part of the quiet rebuilding of Germany's mind. For the first time, many began to question what kind of nation they wanted to rebuild. Did they want another dictatorship that thrived on hate and lies? Or a country that valued work, honesty, and freedom, the very things they had seen in America? Some POWs later admitted that their time in the United States had planted the seeds of democracy in their hearts. They had seen that strength didn't come from shouting orders or blind obedience. It came from giving people the freedom to create, to work, and to think. They had witnessed how ordinary citizens could power a nation simply by doing their jobs with pride. It was a revelation, one that would influence the future of West Germany for decades to come. In later years, when journalists interviewed returning POWs, many described their experiences in almost reverent tones. One former Luftwaffe mechanic said, "In Germany, we had great engineers, but no freedom. In America, they had both, and that made all the difference." Another soldier recalled, "I was treated as an enemy, but I was fed, educated, and respected. That changed me forever." Even American historians would later note how these POWs became unexpected ambassadors, men who carried with them an image of the United States not as a conqueror, but as a builder. They spoke of the endless trains, the machines that never stopped, the workers who laughed as they labored, and the sense of unity that held it all together. When West Germany began its post-war recovery, some of these former prisoners played roles in shaping the new economy. They brought back ideas they had seen in America: efficiency, teamwork, and respect for workers' rights. The economic miracle that rebuilt Germany in the 1950s wasn't born only from money or aid. It was also born from lessons learned in captivity. Still, not all memories were easy. Some prisoners of war struggled with guilt. They thought of what their country had done, the destruction it had caused, the lies it had told. Standing among the ruins, they realized that America's power had never been just about weapons. It was about values, about a system that believed in giving even its enemies a second chance. As the years passed, many of these men returned to America, not as prisoners, but as tourists, workers, or immigrants. They visited the same towns where they had once labored under guard, now free men shaking hands with the same people who had once watched them behind barbed wire. For them, it was more than nostalgia. It was closure. One former POW, visiting decades later, stood in front of the camp where he had been held in Texas and said quietly, "This is where I stopped being a Nazi and started being a human again." His words captured what thousands had felt, that their time in America had not just changed how they saw the world, but how they saw themselves. In the end, the story of the German POWs in America was more than a tale of captivity. It was a story about perspective, about men who arrived as enemies, full of pride and prejudice, and left as witnesses to a different kind of strength. They had seen a nation that could fight a global war without losing its humanity. They had seen a people who built instead of destroyed, who produced instead of plundered, and who believed that freedom was the greatest weapon of all. When they returned home, they carried those lessons with them, quietly but powerfully. And in that way, America's greatest victory wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the hearts and minds of the very men who had once fought against it.